Hi, on today's video I will be building an armchair for our living room. Now that I have the shop reorganized and some wood storage built, it was time to start building some actual furniture. So I took off some offcuts from the dining table build that I had and started working on the chair. Some of you might recognize the design of the chair from the thumbnail, and yeah, I haven't designed the chair myself, or I've taken heavy inspiration from the chairs that Chris from Foureyes made some years ago. He does have plans available for his chair, but I didn't use those. I only used a thumbnail picture that he had as a reference point for my own chair. And an important thing also to mention is that unlike the build that Chris made, I won't be using Domino to do the jointing, but instead go for dowels with a doweling jig. And not to say that it's wrong to use Domino or you shouldn't get the tool. It's a great tool, I would like to have it, but simply just can't afford it. I have other tools that I would prioritize before getting that. And I think using doweling jig might be more relatable to more of you guys, because I don't think that everybody has Festool Domino laying around in their shop. As you can see, there was a lot of prep work needed for these birch boards. They had live edges, I had to cut those off to be able to fit them through my planer and jointer, and then also cutting them to manageable pieces so it was a bit easier to join them as well. And as I'm using the Craig AccuCut jig for cutting the live edges off, I had to do two passes because my circular saw doesn't have big enough blade to cut through the board on one go when using the jig. And I must say that planing down these boards was a lot more fun than doing it when I did the dining table, because the pieces were a lot longer, a lot wider and a lot heavier, so doing these small pieces was quite nice. But then, as I had all the pieces milled down, it was time to start looking for the pieces for my frame. A lot of the boards had some knots, cracks or whatnots on them, and some of them weren't long enough for the purpose that I would need them for, so there was a lot of selection going on. Then, once I had my pieces selected, it was time to start rip cutting them to correct width as well. For my frame, the pieces are 10 centimeters or 4 inches wide, and I will be adding some tapers to them at some point. And don't worry, I won't be doing it the same way I did it last time, with my fingers way too close to the blade. And for the angles on the frame, I didn't have any specific numbers in my mind. I'm not sure what the angles on Chris's chair were, but I just kind of eyeballed mine, laid them on the table and tried to look what would look good. Once I had the first leg piece cut, it was time to cut the second leg and also decide how long the armrest would be. Then, as I had all the leg pieces ready, it was time to decide how high the leg frame would be. And rather than trying to figure out what the angle at the bottom of the legs would need to be, I just laid the frame on top of the table, measured that what the height would need to be, and then drew a line with the straight edge from the table and made the cut from there. Then it was time to start cutting the tapers I mentioned before. I roughly marked where I would want the tapers to be, with the level as a straight guide, to have some sort of reference point on the actual pieces as well. Then we get to the point I made earlier. So last time I made some taper cuts on one of the cabinets I made. I had to have my fingers quite close to the blade, and I didn't really feel that that's the best way to do that. And as someone whose both grandfathers don't have 10 digits left, I really don't want to join that club. So I still had some of the plywood left from the table projects that I made for the shop last time, and I decided I will make a tapering jig that I could use in the future as well. So first I routed out a groove to the plywood that would be deep enough to hide the bolt head, And then with using a bushing, I used a smaller router bit and then routed through the whole plywood so I could push the bolt through the plywood. Then I also made a couple of guide pieces that I would be attaching with thumb screws to the plywood with the bolts. I've seen a lot of people in YouTube attaching the guide pieces with screws just to plywood, and I think that works quite well as well. But I thought that in this way this might be a bit long lasting, since I wouldn't have to be screw things to the plywood and removing them all the time. I also got a couple of these hold down clamps from Bessie that I attached to the jig so I could have those holding the piece down so I could have my fingers far away from the blade. Then it was time to start doing the joinery on the frame. This was probably one of the things that pushed me back on doing the build for quite a long time, because I've been wanting to make the chair for a while already. It would be a nice project to make, and it doesn't require that lot of materials either. But making the joints strong was one of the things that I was worried about, because I don't have the domino, as I mentioned before, and I was a bit unsure on how to get the dowels lined up in the best way. Eventually, I went with the same route I think I would have gone if I had a domino. I marked on the sides of the pieces where I would want the dowels to be, then I lined up my doweling jig in a way that I could easily make the holes on both pieces to the same location. They are not dead center on any of the pieces, but that doesn't really matter. It only matters that they are on the same spot on the jointing pieces. Then to glue up the joints, I had to make some calls, and I've seen a lot of people in YouTube putting some painter's tape between the pieces and super gluing them together. I tried that, but I couldn't get them to stick, so then I just went and glued the calls directly on my frame. And that ended up working quite well. The super glue holds really strong, but when you try to smack it from the sideways like I did, it breaks quite easily and didn't tear out the wood. And if you would want to be even on the safer side, you could use some softer wood when doing the calls, but I used the same wood as I didn't have any other offcuts available. Next, it was time to cut the pieces for the frame of the seat, and I did it in the same way as I did the frame for the legs, so I won't be really going into details here. And now that I had all the pieces for the frame ready, I needed to cut down some slats to go between the seat, because as you can see, without those it's quite narrow. So I had to go and make a quick stop at the local lumberyard, get some 1-inch 25mm birch, and then start to make the pieces for the seat. This was quite quick progress because I didn't need that many pieces. I just rip cut them to size and then used the crosscut sled to cut them to the proper length. Then I just laid them on top of the table just to visualize how they would need to be before starting to make the joints. I first started by drilling the holes on the 4 vertical pieces with the doweling jig, then laid the horizontal pieces on top of the table, clamped them down, then laid all the pieces with proper spacing, then marked a line to use as a reference point to align the pieces correctly, then did the same with the other horizontal piece. Then, using some marking pins, I aligned the lines on both of the pieces and then pushed the pieces together, and then I had the marking pins leaving small holes to the other piece so I could know where to drill the holes on these. Then, as I had the joinery prepped, I started adding some roundovers to all the slats, except on the horizontal pieces. On the jointing edges I didn't touch those but left them to be square. And then it was time to start assembling the 2 pieces, one for the seat and one for the backrest. I remember on the cabinet when I made similar construction I had way more slats to be aligned between the 2 horizontal pieces, and that was really painful to do, so now having only 4 pieces was really easy. I also did some sanding now before I started to assemble the chair, because it was a lot easier to sand all the pieces before they were assembled. Next, it was time to start preparing the joinery between the slats and the frames, and when I did this, it felt a bit tricky to get everything aligned, but now when I went through the footage and looked at it, I'm thinking, why didn't I just add similar marks as I did with the slats and then just use those as alignment points when using the marking pins? It would have been way easier than the way I did it now, because I went with just eyeballing and trying to measure that everything's on the right spot. And in case someone's interested, I'm using 8mm 5/16 of an inch thick dowels on all the joints on the chair. Then, as I had 3 out of the 4 needed joints prepped, it was time to mark the last joints on the chair. It was a bit easier to do it this way once I had all the other joints prepped, because the alignment became much easier and I was able to make sure that all the pieces fitted together with the joints. And once all the joints were prepped, it was time to add some roundovers to the frame pieces as well, just as I did with the slats. And with all the prep work done, it was time to start assemble the seat. And I think now would be a good time to remind you as well that if you are enjoying the video, please consider leaving the like. It helps the video to spread to more people. And if you want to see more videos like this, subscribe the channel as well. And with the seat piece assembled, it was time to start looking on how to attach the legs to the seat. This was something that I was dreading a bit, because I wasn't sure that what would be the easiest way to make sure that the seat is level compared to the legs and that it would be strong enough to hold the weight of whoever's sitting on it. I ended up prepping the joinery on one of the sides first, again using the doubling jig and some marking pins, and since it is just edge grain with edge grain plus the dowels, I think the joints are pretty strong as they are. Once I had the one piece done, then I just repeated the steps on the other, tried to align the seat so it was flat. And then before gluing the whole thing up, I thought that it might be a bit easier to tape all the areas where I don't want to get any glue, because there would be a lot of annoying pockets or corners to try to clean up afterwards, so this prep work was well worth it to avoid any mess after the glue up. And then I had my wife come and help me out when it was time to do the assembly, because the chair is quite wide and heavy, it isn't that easy to move around, so putting the clamps on was a bit easier this way. And then, as the glue up had dried overnight, it was time to check if the joints would be strong enough to hold my weight. And hold your breaths. It did. As a reference point, I weighed somewhere between 80 and 90 kilograms. I don't honestly know where, but somewhere around that area. And for the Americans, that's roughly about 160 or 170 pounds, I think. You should really consider using the units that everybody else in the world are using. It would make everything so much easier. But nevertheless, as you saw, I also made a footrest to go with the chair, kind of the same design as Chris had made for his chair, and I think he also has plans available for that. And then one final step for me before doing the finishing was to add my brand to the chair. The downside with this hot iron is that sometimes the mark isn't really clear on the full picture, and this happened a bit this time. I've seen a lot of people using these maker medallions, and those are really cool, unfortunately I haven't been able to find anywhere to source them in Europe, and ordering them from the States is really expensive and will most likely get even more expensive with the tariffs and everything going on. But if anyone knows where to source these types of medallions in Europe, please let me know down in the comments. And as you saw, for the finish I went again with Rubio Monocoat on the color of Mist 5%. That's the same that we have on the dining table, so this will match nicely to that. I really like how the chair turned out. I like the design, even though it's not my own, but I think it differs a bit from what Chris had on his. And I added some cushions that I made for the chair and the footrest as well to make it a bit more comfortable to sit on. It was really nice to sit on even without the cushions, but with the cushions I think it's way better and it adds a bit of nicer look to it as well. But overall, a really nice project to make. It was nice to not have to make any panels. This didn't require that lot of materials, but it was really fun to build, so really nice. And if you've made it this far onto the video, thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.